Okay, so hopefully the quiz went well for you guys, and we're going to start a new unit. The first one we're going to talk about is basic equations, solving them. Um, really, we're going to focus on the equations part. We'll get to inequalities in the second part. But today's absolute value in linear equations. So some key things here and some definitions. An equation is a statement indicating two algebraic expressions are equal. A solution or root. Root's a big word you're going to see later on. Is a substitution for the variable that satisfies the equation. The set of all solutions to an equation is in a solution set. So there's a difference between evaluating and solving. We can only evaluate expressions by plugging in numbers. We can solve equations. This is due to the algebraic property known as the cancellation property. All right, so an identity equation is an equation satisfied by every real number for which both sides are defined. So this is going to be all real numbers. So there's more than one solution. A conditional equation, an equation satisfied by at least one real number but is not an identity. Normally, we're going to talk about ones that's going to have like one answer or maybe two. Just kind of depends on the problem. And then lastly, we're going to talk about inconsistent equation. That's going to be a no solution one. So let's look at these different types. This equation right here, the first thing I would do is I would distribute. So I would get 4x minus 28 equals 4x minus 28. When you do this, notice both sides are the exact same thing. This is called an identity equation, right? When you look in the mirror, you see yourself, you see your identity. Same way here, 4x minus 28 equals 4x minus 28. They equal each other. All right, so this is going to be all real numbers. And they have to be exactly the same on both sides of the equal sign. Next one we're going to look at, 4x plus 5x would be 9x equals 8x. So I want to move my x's to one side, so the next step would be subtract 8x. I get x equals 0. This is called a conditional equation because it has a solution. It can have more than one solution, and we're going to talk about absolute value equations, which have multiple solutions. But this one just has one answer, right? And then lastly, 2x minus 3, 2x plus 3. If I subtract 2x, that's going to cancel my 2x's on both sides. So I get negative 3 equals 3. Well, does negative 3 equal 3? The answer should be no. So this would be a no solution. All right. So that's the three different types of equations that we have. Really what we're going to talk about is how to solve them more than anything, because on the Hawks it's going to ask you if it has no solution, one solution, or fairly many, and you're going to be able to decide from there whenever you solve. So this one says solve each linear equation. This first one, let's go ahead and distribute the 3, the 5, and the negative 2. And then we're going to go ahead and combine like terms on the right-hand side. So we get 3x plus 9 equals negative 7x plus 11. And I'm going to add my 7x. So I'm going to write that up in here. I'm going to have 10x plus 9 equals 11. I'm going to subtract 9. 10x equals 2. I'm going to divide by 10. X equals 2/10, aka x equals 1/5. And that's what Hawks is going to want. It's going to want that fraction. All right. Now, that's how solving usually goes. You're going to distribute, all right, combine like terms, and then move it to one side if you have to. That would be a conditional equation, though, because it has one answer. All right. Next one, again, I would distribute. Don't be intimidated by the fractions. So 7 over 13w minus 7 over 13 minus 38 over 13 equals negative 3. Well, here's the thing. All of these have the same denominator right now so far, except for the last number that equals negative 3. So I'm going to put this over 1. I'm going to multiply the whole equation by 13. So when you do that, it just cancels the denominator on all these. And so I'm going to have 7w minus 7 minus 38. Notice it's just the numerators. The only one that's going to be different is I take negative 3 times 13 to get negative 39. So now I could add my 7 and my 38 to the other side. So I'm going to get 7w equals 6. I'm going to divide by 7. W ends up being 6/7, which again, Hawks is going to want that fraction. All right? So it's the same type of problem. Notice they almost have the same denominator already. The only one that needs to be changed is I need to multiply the first fraction by 2 over 2 to now have get a denominator of 10. So I'm going to get 10y minus 10 over 10 plus 11 over 10 equals 10y plus 7 over 10. So when you do that, now the denominator is gone. I'm going to have 10y minus 10 plus 11 equals 10y plus 7. I'm going to solve it. I get 10y plus 1 equals 10y plus 7. Subtract 10y. 1 equals 7. Well, you got to ask yourself, does 1 equal 7? If the answer is no, then I would say it's no solution. If the answer was yes, it would be all real numbers. Okay? This one, 2.4w plus 6 equals 4.4w. Try to scare you a little bit when they throw in some decimals. Just go ahead and move your w's to one side. Ends up being 2w, so then I would divide by 2. W equals 3. Hopefully you've done most of this stuff in algebra. It's just now it's a little bit tougher because they throw in fractions and decimals. All right, so that's 4 examples of solving just regular equations. So now we're going to talk about absolute value equations. Notice it says, recall with absolute value equations, we should always have 2 answers. Okay? So here are your steps for absolute value. You want to isolate the absolute value. So what that means is I want to get the absolute value by itself on one side of the equal sign. It does not matter which side. The next step would be to make sure it does not equal a negative. And then the final step is going to be write 2 equations and solve. So this right here, this first one, I have the absolute value of x equals 2. So first step is to isolate the absolute value. It's already by itself on the left-hand side, so we're good with that. Next step is make sure it does not equal negative. Well, it equals a positive 2. When you think about absolute value always has to be a positive number. Absolute value is always positive. So then the third step is to write your 2 equations, x equals 2, x equals negative 2. So you only change the sign of the stuff that is not inside the absolute value. So I went from a positive 2 to a negative 2. Now normally you would solve, but that one's already solved. So you just write that like that and you circle your answer. All right. B, I'm going to isolate the absolute value. It's already by itself on the left-hand side. I'm going to make sure it does not equal negative. Well, here's the thing. It does equal a negative. You cannot have absolute value equal a negative number. So your answer to this problem would be no solution. If you get an absolute value problem and it equals a negative number, it's no solution. Okay? So now we're going to do some more advanced ones. C, 3x minus 7, absolute value of that, minus 4 equals 13. So the first step is to isolate the absolute value. So I've got to get rid of this 4, so I've got to add it to the other side. Now once I've isolated the absolute value, I write my 2 equations after I know it doesn't equal negative, it equals a positive 17, so we're good there. I would say 3x minus 7 equals 17, so I just write down what I have. And then 3x minus 7 equals a negative 17. Notice the stuff inside the absolute value did not change. All right, so now I'm going to solve these equations. I get x equals 8. And x equals negative 10 over 3. Again, Hawks is going to want that fraction, so just leave it in fraction form. Okay? D, same thing. I want to isolate the absolute value. The biggest issue here is most people think you want to distribute the 4 into the absolute value. That is not what you want to do. Instead, I want to divide the whole thing by 4 on both sides. And now I have my absolute value isolated, and it equals a positive number, so we're good there. So I'm going to write my 2 equations out here to the right. The first one, nothing changes. The second one it equals a negative number. So now I would add 8, I would get x equals 11, x equals 5. And those are my two answers. Okay? Now, the one that's tough is E and F. So E, I'm going to throw in down here. If they give you an absolute value equals an absolute value, you do not have to isolate it. Obviously, you can't. So what you do is you go ahead and write two equations. So the first equation, nothing changed. The second equation, you change one of the absolute values. And I'm going to change the signs of everything inside the absolute value. So the second one, I'm going to say negative y minus 3/7 because it was a positive y plus 3/7. So I changed that. And the second part does not change. So you pick one of the absolute values to change. It does not matter which one. So now I'm going to solve. Well, if I solve this first one, I get 3/7 equals negative 6/7. Well, that one doesn't work. And normally absolute value has two answers, but sometimes it does have just one answer. So this one would be no solution on that one. That one does not work. However, we can still solve the other one. So let's say we subtract y. We get negative 2y minus 3/7 equals negative 6/7. I would add 3/7. You get negative 2y equals negative 3/7. Divide by negative 2. You get y equals 3/14. And that one does work. And it is, like I said, possible to have just one answer. Okay? So it just kind of depends on the problem. Really, the only time you're going to see it with absolute value, though, is whenever you're doing absolute value on both sides. Okay? So now F is another one. And you're thinking, oh, well, we just said one that has one answer, so this one's got to have one answer. Well, you still always have to make sure. So if I write my two equations, the first one, nothing changes. The second one, I'm going to change the sign of everything in the first absolute value. The second one stays the same. Now I would solve. This one you get 4 equals x, so that works. Notice nothing is canceled out so far, so everything's still working. And that one works as well. So just make sure you're careful in looking at the problem to understand that it still could have two answers, even though there's an absolute value on both sides. But it could also have one answer. Those are the tricky ones on the HOX, okay? So when you finish this, you're supposed to complete 1.5a HOX as your homework. If you have any questions, please let me know. Again, I have tutoring available from 7:45 to 9 in the morning or from 2:45 to 3:30 after school, okay? Hope you guys have a good day.